The footsteps came again in the dead of night, soft, deliberate, circling his cell like a predator deciding when to strike. Don Carlos jerked awake, his breath sharp and ragged. Beneath him, the thin straw mattress was damp with sweat. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint, wavering glow of a distant torch beneath the iron door. He strained his ears, heart hammering against his ribs. The sound faded, leaving only the echo of his own breathing. Phantoms, he told himself, or worse, his father's spies. Cold seeped through the stone walls, biting into his bones. He pulled the threadbare blanket tighter, but it barely held back the chill. His fingers brushed the rough wall beside him, tracing the grooves where he'd clawed at the mortar in fits of desperation. A metallic taste lingered on his tongue, remnants of the meager meal they'd shoved through the slot hours ago. Gruel, if it could be called that, with a faint tang of rust. He had eaten it without complaint. Hunger had stripped away pride long ago. Hunger gnawed at him constantly now, like a rat on a corpse. His mind drifted to the life he'd lost. The grand halls of the Alcazar. The crown that had never truly been his. His father's face loomed in his thoughts, cold, calculating, those eyes seeing only a threat where a son should have been. "You are no heir of mine." The words still burned, sharper than chains around his wrists. A sudden clang of metal made him flinch. The door's viewing slit snapped open. For a moment, a pair of eyes glinted in the torchlight, watching, judging. Then it was gone. Carlos exhaled, his breath a ghostly mist in the freezing air. The footsteps would return. They always did. And in the silence that followed, he wondered if they were real at all, or if the darkness had finally begun to whisper back. Once, the halls of the Alcazar had been alive with his laughter. He remembered it now as the cold gnawed at his bones. He had been young then, reckless, the golden heir to an empire that stretched across the world. But even in those days, shadows clung to him. Tutors whispered of his temper, how his moods could shift like a storm at sea. One moment he was charming, drawing reluctant smiles from even the sternest courtiers. The next, his voice would roar, his fists would fly, servants scattering like frightened birds. "The prince is not well," they murmured behind their hands. King Philip II heard those whispers. He heard everything. Carlos could still picture his father's face, pale, impassive as marble, those dark eyes missing nothing. The king had never embraced him, not truly. Even as a child, Carlos had felt that distance, the unspoken question hanging in the air, would this boy be my ruin? The first time his father struck him, Carlos was 12, a petty argument over a missed lesson, a cruel remark about his mother's memory. The king's hand moved faster than thought, the crack of palm against cheek echoing through the chamber. "You will learn respect," Philip hissed. Carlos learned many things after that, but respect was not one of them. By 16, his rages were legend. He once hurled a servant down a flight of stairs for spilling wine on his doublet. He shattered a Venetian mirror because his reflection mocked him. The court held its breath when he passed, bracing for the next explosion. And Philip watched, always watched. "He is unstable," Philip confided to his advisors, the words dripping like poison, a danger to himself and to Spain. Carlos knew they spoke of him. He'd seen how his father's gaze lingered in council meetings, as if measuring the space between his shoulders for a blade. Then came the night that sealed his fate. Drunk on stolen wine, Carlos stormed into the royal chapel, shouting oaths that turned the priests pale. He raged against his father's rule, against the suffocating grip of duty, against the God who had cursed him with a crown he would never wear. The king found him there, kneeling before the altar like a sinner begging forgiveness, or a rebel plotting treason. Their eyes met in the candlelight. No words were spoken. None were needed. That night, Carlos saw something in Philip's gaze, shadows deepening into something colder than hate. For the first time, he understood fear. His father did not see a son, he saw a threat. The arrest came without warning. Carlos had been pacing his chambers, wrapped in the heavy fog of sleepless nights. The air smelled of candle wax and damp stone, and the silence was broken only by the distant toll of the monastery bell. Then, boots. Dozens of them, marching in grim unison down the corridor. He turned just as the door burst open. Royal guards flooded the room, breastplates gleaming in torchlight. At their head stood the Duke of Alba, his face a mask carved from stone. By order of His Majesty King Philip II, the Duke intoned, voice flat, "You are to be placed under arrest." Carlos laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "On what charge?" "Treason." The word struck like steel to the gut. He lunged, not at the guards, but toward his desk, where his dagger lay. Futile. Hands seized him, iron strong, wrenching his arms behind his back. He thrashed, snarling curses, but they forced him to his knees. "You can't do this," he spat. "I am your prince." The Duke's expression did not flicker, not anymore. They dragged him through the palace like a common criminal. Courtiers pressed themselves to the walls, eyes wide, not just with shock, but with relief. Whispers slithered in his wake. They say he plotted with the Dutch rebels. I heard he tried to poison the king. Madness runs in his blood. Lies, all of them. The last face he saw before the dungeon swallowed him was his father's. Philip standing at the top of the staircase, motionless as a statue, watching his son's descent into darkness. Their eyes met, one final, silent exchange. No anger, no regret. Only the cold calculation of a king erasing a mistake. The cell door slammed. The key turned. And just like that, Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish Empire, ceased to exist. Time in the dark was meaningless. Days dissolved into nights. Nights dissolved into fever. The air was thick with mildew and the rank stench of his own body. His once fine clothes had rotted into rags, the embroidery now nothing but frayed threads. His trembling hand traced the grooves he'd scratched into the wall to mark the days. The wall told him nothing. No sunlight ever reached him, only the torch outside the door, its light seeping in as a thin, wavering line. He learned to hate that light, its cruel suggestion of a world beyond these four walls. Body began to fail. Fever came and went, leaving him shivering one moment and drenched in sweat the next. Joints ached, stomach gnawed itself in hunger. Guards brought food when they remembered, hard bread, rancid meat, water tasting of rust. He choked it all down. Death was patient, but so was hunger. At night, or what he thought was night, the rats came. At first he tried to kill them, lunging at the shadows. They were too fast. Eventually, he let them be. They took the crumbs he couldn't reach. Perhaps, he thought grimly, one day they'd take him too. Madness crept in like damp through stone. He dreamed of open skies, galloping horses, the throne that should have been his. Waking, he saw faces in the shadows. His father's cold stare, his mother's ghostly smile, a woman he might have loved. They whispered to him until memory and madness became one. Once, in a fit of desperation, he clawed at the walls until his fingers bled, screaming for release. The guards ignored him. They always did, and beyond the cell, the palace hummed with its own whispers. In the kitchens, they say he tears at his own skin. In the stables, he talks to ghosts, names them, his mother, his tutors. Even the king, the courtiers who once bowed and scraped, now spoke his name only with pity or with disgust. Madness runs in the blood, yet not all whispers were so dismissive. In the quieter corners, where loyalty to the crown was thinner, some dared to ask, what if he isn't mad? What if he's right? A young scribe, tasked with recording the prince's rations, once pressed his ear to the cell door. From within came a rasping voice, not real, none of it. The crown was glass. The throne was ash. The scribe recoiled but couldn't shake the thought. What if the prince was the only one who saw the truth? By dawn, the question was gone, buried under the weight of the king's silence. And in his cell, Don Carlos laughed, a broken, low sound at a joke only he understood. The physician arrived at dusk, summoned not to heal, but to witness. Dr. Mendoza was a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers and a face that wore worry like it had been carved there. He had tended nobles and peasants alike, but never a patient like this, never a prince turned into a ghost. The guards led him down into the bowels of the palace. Torchlight licked at damp stone, carving long, warped shadows. The smell grew worse the deeper they went, a choking mix of mildew, unwashed flesh, and something sharper, metallic. "You are to examine him," the captain of the guard muttered. "Not treat him. His Majesty's orders." Mendoza said nothing, but the words sat heavy in his gut. The cell door groaned open. The stench hit first, thick, sour, alive. Then Mendoza saw him. Don Carlos lay curled in the far corner, a bundle of bones wrapped in rotting cloth. His hair hung in matted ropes over his face. Skin clung to him like parchment. When his eyes flickered open, they shone with fever's glassy brightness. "Another phantom," Carlos rasped. "Or have you come to bleed me dry, leech?" Mendoza knelt, setting down his satchel with slow, deliberate care. He didn't flinch when Carlos recoiled, nor when the prince lashed out weakly, a bony hand trembling with defiance. "I'm here to help you, Your Highness," Mendoza lied. The examination was brisk, clinical, each detail another nail in the coffin. Ulcers where chains had bitten deep into flesh. Angry red streaks of infection crawling up his arms. Ribs protruding like the bars of his cage. Breath rattling shallow and uneven. "He needs treatment," Mendoza said sharply, turning to the guards. "Clean bandages. A poultice for the fever. Decent food. He won't last the month otherwise." The captain's face didn't move. "Our orders stand." Mendoza's jaw clenched. "This isn't an examination, it's a murder." Carlos gave a low, rasping chuckle. "Tell my father," he wheezed. "His physician has a poet's tongue. Will he hang you for it, I wonder?" The guards shifted, uneasy. Mendoza hesitated, then reached into his satchel. Not for medicine, there was no defying the king, but for a small vial of lavender oil. He uncorked it, letting the scent drift through the cell's fetid air, and dabbed a drop on Carlos's wrist. The prince inhaled sharply. For a moment, something almost human, clarity even, flickered in his fever-bright eyes. "She wore lavender," he whispered. "My mother, did you know that?" Mendoza did not answer. The captain cleared his throat. "Time's up." As the physician rose, Carlos's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Tell me," he hissed. "Do I seem mad to you?" Mendoza met his gaze. The truth coiled in his throat like a snake, bitter and dangerous. "No, Your Highness," he murmured. "You seem like a man who remembers too much." Carlos released him. Mendoza's footsteps echoed away, but the prince's laughter followed, low, cracked, and unending, until the door clanged shut again. Hunger sharpened its claws. The guards had not brought food in days. Or maybe they had, Carlos couldn't tell anymore. Time had dissolved into thirst and delirium. His lips cracked, blood mixing with spit. The last thing he'd eaten had been crawling with maggots, and still he'd devoured it. Now there was nothing. The rustle came again. Rats, bold as thieves, whiskers twitching in the shadows. He'd grown used to them. But tonight was different. He stared at one, larger than the rest, sniffing at his sleeve. His fingers twitched. A prince of Spain should never touch such vermin. But hunger stripped away titles faster than death. He lunged, his hand closed on fur, warm and writhing. The rat squealed, claws raking his wrist. He gritted his teeth and snapped its neck. The sound was small, final. For a heartbeat, disgust nearly won. Then hunger roared louder. The first bite was the worst, flesh-tough, metallic, bitter, but his body didn't care. By the third bite, he was weeping, hot tears carving lines in the dirt on his face. The others fled, except one, smaller, frozen in terror near the wall. Carlos lunged again. This time, he bit before killing, warm blood flooding his mouth. The rat thrashed until it went limp. He ate until only bones remained. When he was done, he lay back, breath ragged, stomach quiet for the first time in days. The shame came later, his father's voice in his head, cold and victorious, exactly what I always knew you were. Carlos began to laugh, dry and broken. Then it twisted into a sob, then into a scream. Outside the cell, guards exchanged glances. He's finally lost it, one muttered. But inside, Don Carlos wasn't listening. He was already imagining the next rat. Anna had no reason to be near the prince's cell. Servants learned early. Curiosity could get you whipped, or worse. But still, she came. The corridor was nearly empty, torchlight stuttering against damp stone. The guards had grown careless after all. What danger could a man already half-dead pose? She heard it then, a faint, broken groan. A bucket of scraps rested at her feet. Stale bread, a wedge of cheese, a skin of water stolen from the kitchens. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in weeks. Her hand hovered over the feeding slot. The king had ordered his son starved, spirit first, body second. To disobey was treason. But Anna remembered the boy he'd once been, reckless, yes, but capable of kindness in a court that had little use for it. She remembered him tossing coins to beggars, sneaking sugared almonds to the scullery children, laughing like the world was his. She lifted the slot's cover. The stench hit like a blow, sour sweat, festering wounds, the metallic tang of blood. The prince lay curled on the floor, ribs jutting like blades, hair a matted snarl. Chains bit into swollen wrists. Anna pushed the water skin through. It landed with a dull thud. For a heartbeat, she thought him dead. Then his head lifted. Fever-bright eyes locked onto the offering. He lunged, seized it, and drank until water spilled down his chin and chest. He stared at the empty skin as if it were gold. Then, hoarse, desperate. More. She shoved the bread and cheese through before she could lose her nerve. He tore into it with an animal's violence. A boot scuffed stone behind her. Anna spun. The captain of the guard stood at the far end of the corridor. Her heart stuttered. But he only looked at her, expression unreadable, before turning away, his footsteps fading into silence. Anna ran, but the prince's whisper followed her. "Thank you." She told herself she wouldn't return. She knew she was lying. The fever had him in its grip now. Carlos drifted in and out of waking. The cell walls swelled and breathed like the ribs of some great beast. Voices threaded through the dark, his mother's gentle murmur, his betrothed's sigh, his father's cold verdict. Maria Manuela stood before him, bathed in impossible light, her smile tinged with sorrow. "Too much fire," she said softly. "Too much for this cold court." "Take me with you," he begged. "Not yet, my love." She vanished. Then Isabella appeared, dark eyes wet with grief. "You could have been happy." "No," he rasped. "Not in this world." Her breath was warm against his ear. "Then close your eyes, my prince. The next one will be kinder." The door creaked, real this time. Philip II stood framed in torchlight, black velvet, silvered beard, a king carved from stone. Carlos forced a ragged laugh. "Come to watch me die?" The king's gaze swept over him, every wound, every hollow. Something flickered in those dark eyes. Regret? Relief? "You should have been stronger," Philip said at last. "And you," Carlos coughed blood, "should have been a father." The words cut like a blade. Philip turned away. "Wait," Carlos's voice broke. "Tell me, was it ever real? Any of it?" A pause. For a moment, Carlos thought he might answer. Then the door closed. When Anna returned, the end was near. She knelt beside him, pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Neither should you." He wanted to laugh. Instead, he coughed, copper flooding his mouth. "Do they still speak of me?" "Yes," she lied. Then softer, "I remember." "What?" "The oranges," she said. "You stole them from the kitchens, tossed them to the courtyard children. You laughed when the Duchess scolded you. The memory surfaced, a flash of sun, sour citrus, children's delighted grimaces. They were sour, he murmured. They loved you for it. The bell tolled, midnight perhaps. His eyelids grew heavy. Will you stay until the end? He closed his eyes. His breath slipped out, soft and unburdened. Anna wept. Outside, Spain slept. The king did not stir. But in the dark, where no one would think to look, a single candle burned beside the body of a prince who was, at last, free.